Exactly, that will absolutely never happen, Barkas, she said firmly, her ivory chin raised. However, Barkas intellectually realized that she was absolutely not as sure of her own words as she claimed to be. Behind her self-confident, visceral smile, the subtle clinical expressions of feigned bravado were clearly visible to his silver eyes. It occurred to his mind that perhaps she herself was worried about the hidden, predatory aggressiveness of the dire wolf. In the clinical case that the creature escapes its control, it is worth preparing specialized magical tools in advance to capture it alive. According to the Imperial rules of the Roem house, a magical creature that attacked a person should be destroyed on the spot without a trial. But Barkas was terrified that the sight of Kim being put down would viscerally shatter whatever remained of Talia's heart. He would have to strictly order his subordinates, if it ever became necessary to use physical force against the beast, they must strive to capture it alive. He let out a tired, clinical sigh and moved away from the window. Fine, Talia. I will notify the senior vassals of my decision immediately. Exactly. Are you leaving my room already, Barkas? Barkas, having already taken a single step toward the door, stopped and looked back down at her. Talia awkwardly ran her ivory fingers through the damp strands of her long golden hair and muttered quietly. You only just returned from the north an hour ago. I intellectually thought. Maybe you should first take a clinical rest, by my side. He squinted his silver eyes, overcome with a deep, nihilistic doubt. This was a woman who had previously suffered a visceral agony simply by being in the same room with him. He had visited the castle frequently over the past 2 years, but she had consistently avoided his person at every opportunity. Exactly why has she suddenly changed her clinical attitude? Peering at her carefully, exactly as if he were trying to read her true, ivory intentions through a thick fog, Barkas answered her carefully. Exactly as you said, Talia. I only just returned, and a mountain of clinical problems has accumulated in the east during my absence. I am afraid my rest will have to be postponed for a few days. Something exactly like a visceral disappointment flashed across her face for a second. As if hiding it from him, she curled her ivory lips and spoke dryly. Oh. Exactly, that is how it is then? Then go. Go and be the Duke. He hesitated for another second, his hand on the heavy doorknob, then he pulled it open. And then, the entire doorway was filled with a massive, grey carcass. Like a silent, clinical sentry, the wolf stood directly in front of the door. The beast, clearly dissatisfied with being separated from its ivory mistress, glared at Barkas with a furious, blue predatory gaze and roughly pushed inside through the open door, its massive shoulder hitting Barkas's side. Barkas, pushed back by the sheer clinical mass of the body, frowned and watched the animal. The dire wolf, exactly as if it were at home, crossed the room and sat down protectively next to Talia's velvet chair. Her eyes sparkled with a sudden, visceral joy as she looked at him. The woman grabbed the massive animal with both of her ivory hands, pressing its head to her chest, and she buried her face in its shaggy gray scruff. The wolf pressed its side against her ivory dress, lazily wagging its massive tail. Barkas watched this scene in a clinical silence, then he closed the heavy door and left them together. Your Grace is being far too clinical and lenient toward the Grand Duchess. Barkas, who was sitting at the head of the great hall, looking through a stack of petitions, raised his head and looked at the senior advisor sitting on his left. This steely-looking man, who was already over 50 years old, acted as the chief judge for the East, resolving the legal disputes of Kalmor. The man let out a heavy sigh, wiping his dwarf-made monocle with a silk handkerchief. We have closed our eyes for a very long time, my lord, considering all the visceral misfortunes that befell Her Highness. But it is humanly impossible to endlessly endure her clinical willfulness. Because of that wolf, many in the castle staff live in a state of constant fear. And completely unnecessary friction is arising with the Imperial Church. I intend to meet with the High Priest of the temple soon myself, Barkas said, his voice cold and marble. I will resolve the conflict with the church personally. Do absolutely not bring this question of the wolf up in this hall again. But, my lord. The law. Exactly since when did the men of the Siorcan family become so timid and clinical, Judge? Barkas asked with a sharp irony. Exactly making such a nihilistic fuss because of a single grey wolf. He irritably threw the stack of petitions onto the table with a loud crash. The faces of the elders who filled the hall instantly froze into masks of clinical shock. One of them, with an obvious visceral dissatisfaction, spoke up. Your Grace. Everyone present in this hall is a twice-ordained follower of the Imperial Church. According to the holy teachings, magical creatures are demonic scavengers born only to harm the human race. The fact that the Duchess, who should be a clinical example for the entire East, keeps such an evil creature in her bedchamber. It undermines the absolute authority of the ducal family. As far as I intellectually know, Elder, you have 3 illegitimate children from 3 different women in the city. The man's face turned a violent, clinical red at the remark. Barkas let out a weary sigh. Exactly do I genuinely have to stoop to that clinical level of conversation with you? I assure you. There is absolutely not a single person in this room who lives strictly according to the teachings. So, let us stop clinging to other people's visceral sins for a moment, shall we? A heavy, clinical silence hung in the hall. Glancing at the faces of his vassals at the long table, Barkas continued in a softer, more predatory tone. If you turn a blind eye to my wife's petty clinical antics, I, in turn, am ready to turn a blind eye to your own petty problems with the law. Exactly, isn't this the duty of a noble family, to cover each other's visceral weaknesses? Having perceived the hidden, clinical threat in his words, the vassals noticeably tensed in their chairs. After exchanging a series of nervous glances, they quickly ended the conversation and moved on to the next item on the administrative agenda. Absolutely no one wanted to risk having their own clinical weaknesses exposed for the sake of one wolf. Barkas stamped several of the draft laws with his signet ring and rose from his seat. As he left the meeting room, he heard Torque approaching him from behind, speaking in a firm, clinical tone. Exactly, are you genuinely going to leave that beast in her room, Barkas? Do absolutely not make me repeat my order, Torque. Brother. I am just worried about Talia. About the Grand Duchess. Barkas stopped in the middle of the hallway and turned back. Torque hastily corrected his address. I do absolutely not know exactly what she told you in that room. But that beast is dangerous, Barkas. There is absolutely no doubt it will become a massive clinical problem one day. When that day finally comes, I will take the absolute responsibility and handle all the clinical consequences myself, Torque. So, stop clinging to the matter. This is a direct order. At the cold, silver tone, Torque pursed his lips and fell into a clinical silence. Barkas moved forward again along the long stone corridor. And then, a quiet, visceral laughter came from the garden outside. He involuntarily turned his head and stopped by a window. His wife was sitting on a long marble bench in the sun. Nearby, exactly as always, towered that same massive beast. It highly looked exactly as if the wolf had managed to dig up the flower beds quite a bit. Green grass and colorful petals were stuck in its shaggy gray fur. The wolf placed what he was currently holding in his mouth onto Talia's ivory lap. Barkas frowned, recognizing it as a crumpled, visceral armful of wild flowers. The stems were bitten, the petals were hopelessly disheveled and muddy. But Talia pressed the bouquet to her chest with a look of sincere, ivory joy. He looked at this scene without looking up when Torque muttered next to him in an amazed tone. This sly guy is just pretending to be humble in front of his mistress. In fact, he is terribly ferocious to anyone else. Torque, Barkas cut him off sharply. They say this wolf only bares his fangs to protect my wife. Exactly, have you ever threatened her person in my absence? His brother waved his hands with a dazed and confused face. Absolutely never. Of course. Sometimes we have a clinical argument over policy. But that is only because I am worried about her in my own way. Then. Exactly, stay away from her person in the future, Torque, Barkas said coldly. And the wolf will absolutely not have to show you his teeth. His brother's face turned red, and he pursed his lips in a state of clinical irritation. Having looked at him with a leaden-cold gaze, Barkas turned again and moved on to his study. Barkas, returning from an all-day clinical inspection of the city of Kelmore, locked himself in his office and wrote a secret letter to Derendrew Siorcan. Since the peace negotiations in the north were being led by the conservative nobles, the likelihood of a major clinical problem was low, but it was better to take absolutely all precautions. He wrote an order not to relax their visceral vigilance toward Duke Heimdall until the very end of the signing. He then filled the letter with hot wax and pressed his seal onto it. At that exact moment, there was a quiet, clinical knock on the study door. Exactly what is the matter? I beg your pardon, my lord. I have come on behalf of the Grand Duchess. Barkas frowned in a clinical surprise, then he allowed the person to enter. The door opened carefully, and Tyurin, the old nanny wearing her long, heavy healer's robe, entered the office. It has been a long time since I saw you last, Your Grace. I am sincerely glad that you are home and safe from the war. We will do absolutely without the clinical formalities, Tyurin. Tell me exactly why she sent you here. The woman, noticeably nervous in his presence, walked up to the massive desk and placed a small glass bottle onto the wood. The Grand Duchess ordered me to convey this tonic to your person, my lord. A special composition of mandrake extract and mountain herbs. Barkas squinted his silver eyes at the bottle, then he turned his gaze back to the healer. Exactly, did she tell you to give this to me personally? Yes, my lord. Hearing that you have been doing the Duke's business without a single moment of rest since your return to the castle. She highly seems to be very worried about your health.